No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
Colorblindness is convenient, isn't it? Because if race is not a thing anymore, I don't have to deal with any of the present-day implications of it.
That's New York Times bestselling author and historian Jemar Tisby discussing his most recent book, The Spirit of Justice.
A lot of times, what is driving people's actions around justice is not the sentiment of how do we prevent harm, how do we make sure we do what's right, but it's fear.
We'll also explore the role that faith might play in our current political landscape.
I don't want us 30, 40 years from now to look back and say the church was passive. I want us to be able to say we stood up for justice when democracy was on the line.
All coming right up. It's summertime, and that means I'm now planning some of my summer adventures with my lovely wife, Laura. But wherever summer takes us, we all need nourishment that keeps up with our daily adventures. So I'm quite pleased to have just learned about Ka'Chava. Here's my experience so far, that the Ka'Chava whole body meal shake first tastes great. I must say, I thought it might not be possible, given that it is chock full of amazing stuff like 26 vitamins and minerals, 85 plus superfoods and nutrients, all to keep your body and mind nourished all day. I love me some coconut, so I immediately tried the coconut acai and was honestly surprised how great it tasted. I was also especially pleased to see that the 25 grams of protein in each serving is plant-based. So fill your day with Ka'Chava. Go to Ka'Chava.com and use code ENDEAVOR for 15% off your next order. That's Ka'Chava.com, Kachava.com, code ENDEAVOR for 15% off. Lately, my lovely wife, Laura, and I have been trying to clean up the way we do a lot of our chores and errands to simplify our lives. And so one of the ways we've tried to do that is to clean up the way we shop for groceries. And so recently we gave Thrive Market a shot. And honestly, we're a big fan. You can get the same high-quality brands you love, but for less and without compromising your standards. They actually ban over 1,000 ingredients that are still allowed in U.S. products, and the site is super easy to shop. You can filter by diet, like gluten-free, paleo, keto, low sugar, vegan, so you're not wasting time reading every label. It's not just food. Thrive has supplements, household items, and clean beauty too. All vetted and all way more affordable than you or I expect. And the shipping, fast and carbon neutral. Head over to thrivemarket.com/endeavor to get 30% off your first order and a free $60 gift. That's thrivemarket.com/endeavor, thrivemarket.com/endeavor. Hello, friends. One of the things I've taught students for many years now is that one of the most important things they can do is pay attention to their meta habits. Big habits that leave lots of things in their wake, and that this is key to living life well. For centuries, the cardinal virtues were thought of as just such meta habits, profound practices that have a disproportionately large impact upon your life. The four cardinal virtues: courage, temperance, prudence, and justice. They were considered essential to a good life, but today we hardly talk about them. Most people can't even name them. That's why we're launching a special 4-part series exclusively on NSE+. In this series, I'll take a deep dive into these virtues, what they mean, why they matter, and how they shape a meaningful life. Think of it like a private college course, except it's way practical. Join us on NSE+ to start listening today. Sign up at nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSE+. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. According to an AP VoteCast survey of over 120,000 American voters, Donald Trump won roughly 80% of the white evangelical vote in the 2024 election. This is an incredible landslide in any given block of potential voters and a huge win for any presidential candidate. Meanwhile, 83% of black Protestant voters voted for Harris. As a theologian and a white Christian at that, such a sweeping endorsement is hard for me to ignore. It prompts questions about the intersection of faith, politics, and race in the U.S., as well as the role of the church in our increasingly divided nation. Our guest today is Jemar Tisby, and he has spent much of his professional and personal life exploring such complex realities around Christianity in America. He is a historian and scholar of race, religion, and social movements, and his work brings historical insight to some of the most urgent, pressing questions of our time. He's also the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Color of Compromise, and more recently, The Spirit of Justice, subtitled True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. Jemar serves as professor of history at Simmons College in Kentucky and is known for his sharp commentary on NPR, CNN, and in outlets like the New York Times. Here's our conversation with Jemar Tisby. Dr. Tisby, welcome.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
So pleased to have you with us and grateful to get to connect with you today. So the work that you've done in recent years, the political and historical work, is clearly inseparable from your faith, but you didn't grow up a Christian, correct?
Yeah, I didn't. And it's interesting, though, because as I ponder my childhood more as an adult, it was still sort of a faith-infused atmosphere. So I didn't grow up in a religious household, but I went to Catholic schools from kindergarten through 8th grade. I wasn't Catholic or anything like that, but God or the spiritual was never extraneous to my experience. Nevertheless, it really wasn't until high school that I started taking my own personal faith seriously and had what I would call a conversion experience.
And that context was in a evangelical context, is that correct?
Oh, yeah. It was a white evangelical church, and this is what Christians in that era would call friendship evangelism. And so I was in high school, a public high school, and there was this guy in my class who was a Christian. I didn't know that. All I know is that he didn't cuss. And that really stood out to me in that time. It's like, there's something different about this guy. Anyway, we strike up a friendship, and over the course of several months, he finally invites me to Wednesday night youth group. And that's where the plot thickens, so to speak.
So in that context, did you get much of a sense of the issues that have further driven your work about thinking about questions of social injustice or structural injustice at that time, or was that something that was not really on the radar?
It was not on the radar. And what's interesting about it is, as my work centrally focuses on racial justice, and I look back at my early experiences with race and Christianity, in that context, it wasn't about what people said. It's about what they didn't say. And it's not about what they did, it's about what they didn't do. So nobody was over here calling me a racial slur, saying, you can't play with us because you're brown. It wasn't anything like that. It was more so that race just didn't exist. These realities that we live in and experience vastly different Americas because of skin color and the history, it's just like it didn't happen. And so this was the colorblind approach that a lot of evangelicals take, where the solution to racism is we don't see color, we don't see race, we don't talk about it, and everybody is all the same. I get the sentiment, right? Like, I want to honor the impulse in people that says racism has been a problem. I don't want it to be a barrier between us interpersonally. But the solution to that is not to act as if race doesn't exist. While it is a social construct, it's not based in a biological reality, it has nothing more to do with biology than the amount of melanin in your skin. It does have real impacts in the world, and it shapes my experience and my perspective and who I am. I don't know that in most contexts, blindness is a benefit. Rather, we should be clear-eyed about it. And so what I would rather is people acknowledge that race and racism exist and try to understand where I'm coming from because of my racialized experience in the United States.
At what point did you begin in your youth to become aware of dynamics of race or dynamics of structures and systems related to race?
Some of my earliest memories outside of my family were in that Catholic school that I was talking about. We would go to Mass once a week, and I noticed that all the kids would go up to receive the Eucharist except the Black kids. And at first I thought it was a racial thing. Turns out all the Black kids were Baptist. And so we didn't receive Catholic Eucharist. So it was a denominational thing, but it fell along color lines. And then as I got older and my friends would hang out, and this was a racially and ethnically diverse group. We had folks who were of Mexican descent, Black, Filipino, white. I would notice, though, we would go to the arcade and we'd be followed by the police officer who was assigned to the place, or we'd be followed in stores. I remember one particular incident in high school. It was me and my best friend who was Black and one of our friends who was female and white. My best friend and I, we had parked at a 7-Eleven. He and I were in the front seat and she was in the back seat. A police officer, totally unrelated, pulls up next to us, was just going in the store for something else. But he eyes us walking into the store and notices this combination of people. Then on the way out, he stops, taps on the glass, has me roll down my window, doesn't speak to me. He leans back so he can speak to the young lady in the car. And he says, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you here against your will?"
Wow.
So I was aware of race living as a Black man in America, but it wasn't till later that I started thinking about race in the context of religion.
So you go on to be an undergrad at Notre Dame, and then after that, you go and serve and teach for America?
That's right. They assigned me to the Mississippi Delta in a town called Helena, Arkansas, which is in Phillips County. And it was listed one year as the fourth poorest county in the country. This is a direct legacy of racialized history. The Mississippi Delta is cotton country. All these pictures you see of these big fields of cotton, very likely that picture was taken in the Delta. And so this was a big plantation economy. At one point, there were parts of Mississippi that had more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the country because of the plantation. And then after the Civil War and the 13th Amendment and emancipation, the physical chains of slavery were taken away, but then the invisible shackles of poverty were latched on. And so what happens after slavery is sharecropping and convict leasing. And these poor Black farmers became sharecroppers, but then in the 1950s comes mechanization. And all of a sudden, you don't need dozens or hundreds of people hand picking cotton. You can have one machine that does that work. And so a lot of these folks were unemployed or underemployed, and that legacy of poverty has continued to this day. So that was a real awakening to me about the material implications of racism and the momentum that history has on up into the present day.
Then in 2014, another significant turning point, it seems to me, in your work with Mike Brown being killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Would you see that as another significant turning point for yourself?
Absolutely. So it was in the Mississippi Delta that I started to think critically about, well, what does my religion have to say about issues of justice? How does it affect the poverty and the suffering that I'm seeing on a daily basis, where my kids would walk in? I was a sixth grade teacher, and we had breakfast at the school, but oftentimes students would come in saying they had breakfast, and it turned out to be they had stopped at the gas station for hot Cheetos and Kool-Aid pickles.
Oh, wow.
And it was more than just convenience. It was essentially their grocery store, because it was, what some people would call a food desert. So all of this is happening. And at the same time, there's not one church on every block. There's 2 churches on every block. This is deep in the Bible Belt. And I'm like, what is all this faith doing? What is all this good religion doing for the actual suffering of people? So that's where I started to connect the dots. And then 2008, Obama gets elected. That's a big deal. That's a big deal in the nation. And it also starts to reveal some of the racial rifts, because those rifts were always there. But I would say before that, there was this period, maybe from the early 90s to the mid 2000s, where, at least in evangelicalism, there was this big movement toward racial reconciliation. There was this big movement toward multiracial churches, right? And then you get these catalyzing events. First Black president, the murder of Trayvon Martin. Some would call my generation the Trayvon Martin generation, because that's one of the events that really opened our eyes to the ongoing effects of racism. And it's because of Trayvon Martin's murder that this phrase, Black Lives Matter, comes about. That came about in 2013 with the acquittal of George Zimmerman, but then it catches on nationally in 2014 with the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. So that hashtag was already there, but it didn't go viral till August 2014. And that was a real moment of, in Christian circles, we have this term apocalypse or apocalyptic moments. And in the classic sense, apocalypse means a revealing and unveiling. And so that was an apocalyptic moment in the sense that it revealed the continuing racial divide despite this veneer of racial reconciliation and unity.
Was there a new kind of fire then under you in 2014, or what was that like for you internally at that point?
It was shocking, really, because we would say something straightforward like Black Lives Matter, and we would get the retort among our fellow co-religionists that all lives matter or blue lives matter, as if saying Black Lives Matter was some sort of attack or some sort of errant statement. And what struck me was, are y'all not seeing this? Like, do you not see the same thing that I see, which is that what happened with Mike Brown, and then for the next several years, a slew of other similar incidents involving anti-Black police brutality, that it's part of a pattern, that we had a Rodney King, that the Black Panther Party was formed. Originally, its title was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Self-defense against who? Police who were coming into Black neighborhoods and brutalizing the population there. And so the big divide between white evangelicals and Black people, particularly Black Christians, is our views of systemic and institutional racism.
Would you say that there are additional / larger, particularly American impulses that makes that possible that you just described? I mean, so for example, I'm wondering simply the degree to which we tend in the States to be so forgetful and historically illiterate, and that to connect dots like you're talking about, it requires some work, right? It requires some intellectual work. And it seems to be the kind of work that a lot of times we don't seem to be particularly willing to do. So I'm thinking of that as one possible inclination, character of the American self that inhibits our seeing systemic realities. But comments on that or other kind of tendencies that inhibit that in us?
Ooh, as a historian, I'm fired up about our lack of historical knowledge here. And there are like certain mechanical factors, right? Like, so I was a teacher in the No Child Left Behind era, where standardized testing was the thing. It determined your funding, it determined your status, and you literally got a grade as a school. And so so much of our teaching was limited by the fact that we had to make sure kids passed a standardized test, which meant I didn't have time to sort of dwell or tarry on a lot of the nuances of history. And there was a lot of history to teach. There's U.S. history, there's global history, there's all kinds of history, ancient history. And so there's just not a lot of time in the curriculum, even K through 12, to actually delve into the information we need to know. The other thing that mitigates against us really understanding the past in a way that's helpful in the present is this idea of American exceptionalism. This idea of the United States was founded as this glorious nation, and even though we have flaws, history has been a consistent march toward progress. And what that does is fails to acknowledge the fact that progress came as a result of struggle and resistance, and B, it downplays the atrocities that have been done in the name of a political empire, whether that is a genocide and the theft of land of indigenous people, whether that is wealth built literally on the blood, sweat, and tears of enslaved labor, whether that is working against common laborers. And this is what's happening right now with executive orders around the Smithsonian Institution, around quote unquote patriotic education. They want to inculcate this idea of American exceptionalism, which either whitewashes or downplays the really moral quandaries that the history of this nation poses to us.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with New York Times bestselling author and historian Jemar Tisby. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode and a full transcript. We also have a free bi-monthly newsletter in which I riff on themes and behind-the-scenes goings-on called the NSC Notebook. You can subscribe to that newsletter for free by going to our website at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Coming up, Jemar and I discuss his book, The Spirit of Justice, the legacy of activism in the Black American Church, and the personal cost of political engagement. We are most excited to announce that we'll be having our second NSC Plus book club with an author on June 26 at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. Professor Rebecca DeYoung will join us to discuss her book, Glittering Vices. It's a great book. Order your copy of the book and mark your calendars. If you're not yet a member of NSC Plus, join at the link in the show notes or visit nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus. Show up with questions and get ready to sit in on a great conversation. I'd like to turn to two of your books, one briefly, and then your more recent book at a little greater length. But your earlier New York Times bestseller, The Color of Compromise, especially leveling a critique of the complicity of the American church in racism. So maybe give us a summary of the kind of critique that you do in that book.
So the subtitle of The Color of Compromise is The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism. And to demonstrate that, I start the book with the story of Charles Morgan Jr. He was a white lawyer in Birmingham, Alabama, and this is 1963. The 16th Street Baptist Church is bombed, and that's when the 4 little girls are killed at church. And it's in the immediate wake of that Charles Morgan Jr. gives a previously scheduled speech to this all-white group of businessmen in the city. And he asks this all-white audience, who did it? Who threw that bomb? And he says the answer should be, we all did it. Now, what is he talking about there? Is he saying that this crowd of people was placing dynamite? No, he's saying that when we had the opportunity to speak up and to stand for justice and stand for racial equity, we didn't. And because we stood by, it allowed for heinous acts like this church bombing to happen. So what he's talking about there is not the active work of racial terrorism. He's talking about passivity in the face of injustice. And that, to me, illustrates the idea of racial compromise and complicity. It's not always what you do, it's what you don't do. It's not always what you say, it's what you don't say. And he was challenging his audience that we can't say this was just some extremist and it has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with what we did or didn't do.
Would it be fair to maybe summarize it? The Color of Compromise is in many ways a sort of critique, as you were just unpacking there, of the church in America. But your more recent book, The Spirit of Justice, kind of turns that around and looks at the ways in which the Christian tradition in America actually leveraged critique and made possible critique. Is that a fair assessment?
You got it. You found the secret sauce here. You sort of have to begin with the problem. What I wanted to do, one, I wrote The Color of Compromise while I was in grad school for my PhD in history, which I don't recommend because it didn't even turn out to be my dissertation. So I ended up writing not one, but two books in grad school, plus the dissertation. But with The Color of Compromise, what I wanted to show was the ways that Christians who have these wonderful teachings in the Bible about all people being made in the image of God, and about, in Revelation, people of every tribe, tongue, and nation gathered around worshiping Jesus, right? We have all the resources in our faith to promote racial justice. And yet, when it came to white Christians and white churches, so often they were on the wrong side of justice. So that was a historical survey from the 15th century to the 21st century, giving just examples and samples of how that played out. But that's not the whole story. I wanted to make sure to explain to people that there was another Christian witness in the face of racism, in the face of white supremacy. And that witness is the Black church. That witness is the Black Christian tradition. And so on the cover of the book, I have three people. In the center is the most recognizable figure, Coretta Scott King. Long past time that she gets her due as a global human rights activist, completely separate from her role as the spouse of Martin Luther King Jr. There's another woman on the cover who also is long overdue for her credit, and that is Anna Murray Douglas. And she is the first wife of Frederick Douglass, the famed abolitionist. It's Anna Murray Douglas who actually helps Frederick Douglass escape. She's a seamstress. She sews the uniform, the sailor's uniform that he uses on the train going north. She secures a version of freedom papers, which is essentially a fake ID that a Black person can roam about and is not enslaved somewhere. And she supports him financially because escaping from slavery, he doesn't have any money. And then he goes on these long tours, including a 2-year stint in Europe, and she's at home alone, raising their 5 kids. So she's a huge part of the story of Frederick Douglass. The last figure on the cover of the book is somebody no one's ever heard of, is Reverend E.C. Morris, Elias Kemp Morris. He is the first president of the National Baptist Convention, USA, Inc., which is the largest Black religious body in the country. And funny enough, the church he pastored was in Helena, Arkansas, the very town where I lived as a teacher during the Teach for America program. For 20 plus years, he's the leader of the largest Black religious organization in the country that persists to this day, and nobody's ever heard of him. So I wanted to tell these stories about not just people resisting racism, but people resisting racism because of their faith, and show the flip side of something like The Color of Compromise.
Yeah. Your book begins with a moving story about Myrlie Evers. Could you share that with us?
This was one of those moments where, as a historian, you get to witness history. So this was back in 2017 at the grand opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And folks maybe forget, but this was shrouded in controversy, right? The governor at the time, Phil Bryant, invited the president at the time, Donald Trump, to come to the grand opening. A lot of people weren't happy about that because of Trump's stances on race and racial policies. And so there were several dignitaries that pulled out of the ceremonies as a result of that, including the legendary civil rights activist and congressperson John Lewis. Benny Thompson, the local rep, refused to go, but Myrlie Evers did. And here's the thing. Murray Evers took a private tour of the museum before the ceremonies began. And in the museum, there's this tiny little theater. I'm talking maybe fits 8 to 10 people. And it's darkened, and the only light in there is from the glow of the screen and also this small spotlight. The small spotlight is shining on a rifle, the same rifle that killed her husband, Medgar Evers, in 1963. And I recently went back to the museum, and the size of that theater struck me. Because when you go in, you aren't more than an arm's length away from that rifle display. And so can you imagine what Murray Evers must have felt being in that room, steps away from the weapon that killed her husband and absolutely shattered her life? But after all that, she gives this nationally televised speech, has this beautiful message of hope and unity. Then she gives this smaller press conference, and that's where I was when I recorded her saying the words, "But there's something about the spirit of justice." A journalist had asked her, well, how does now in the 21st century, in terms of race relations, compare to the civil rights movement when you were active, when your husband was killed? And she said something very sobering. She says, "I'm seeing things now that I hoped I'd never see again." She's saying that after all these years, we haven't made as much progress as we would have hoped. And yet in the context of that, she says, but there's something about the spirit of justice. And she says it's like a war horse that's been put out to pasture, but then it hears the bell, and she calls it the bell of freedom. And it becomes straight and the back becomes stiff. And she ends with these words, "And you become determined all over again." And I sat back and said, whoa. Murray Evers in 2017 was in her 80s. By the way, she's still alive today. The past is not that long ago. And here she was, a woman who had dedicated her life to civil rights and human rights activism. She should be relaxing by a pool, drinking a drink that has an umbrella in it and enjoying the fruits of her labor. And yet she says, "I'm ready to keep fighting."
So you've got The Color of Compromise doing this critique of American Christianity, and The Spirit of Justice that's doing a sort of celebration of Christianity, or one strand of Christianity in America. How do you think about holding those together? And why would you even want to hold those two things together?
Because a lot of people say Christianity is the white man's religion. And I'm like, well, what about the black church? Even further, what about the fact that Christianity is in Africa long before it's in Europe, going all the way back to biblical texts, right? So I think it's a very one-sided view when people look at religion in general and Christianity in specific and say it's simply a tool of oppression. It's only a tool of empire and exploitation. Well, you have to look at the ways oppressed people have understood religion. And in the US context, I wanted to look at the way Black Christians have understood the faith. And I think actually Frederick Douglass articulates this well. In his first autobiography, in the appendix, he writes about the difference between the Christianity of Christ and slaveholder Christianity, or what he calls the Christianity of this land. Throughout his autobiography, he's talking about the hypocrisy, and even would say that the cruelty ramped up for slaveholders who called themselves Christian. But it's so interesting that after his whole autobiography, where he's highlighting the contradiction between enslaving people, whipping them, sexual assault, all of these things, and calling yourself Christian, at the end of that, he's like, but I don't want you to get the wrong idea about what I think about religion. And so he pens this appendix where he says, look, when it comes to the Christianity of Christ, I love the pure, peaceable religion of Jesus, but I hate the women whipping, cradle plundering religion of the slaveholder. So that is illustrative because it makes the distinction between what Jesus is teaching and the center of the Christian faith versus what other people have done to corrupt and twist the faith.
One of the things that I found myself making notes in the margins repeatedly in the spirit of justice that really stood out to me is that I don't know how many stories you have, maybe 50 or so.
That's right, 50 plus.
50 plus. And so as I was kind of working through so many of those stories of courageous pursuits of justice, it really was impressive to me the great number and varied shape of vocational pursuits that was represented by all this cast of characters, right? So and that was encouraging to me at the level of saying there's this sort of invitation in your storytelling to say, you don't have to kind of pull up with whatever you're doing in life and go become an activist. It's pay attention to where you are, your own community, your own job, show up, bear witness to justice. And yes, activists, but also there are lawyers, there's writers, there are academics, there's actors, there's artists, there's teachers. I find that very helpful. So maybe unpack that a little bit for us about how to look for our own space of doing the work of justice in wherever we might find ourselves.
In the opening chapter, I make a loose distinction between resistance, advocacy, and activism. And I do that so that we do understand the breadth and the scope of the ways we can push back against injustice. So resistance is anything we do to encourage the flourishing of life in the midst of a context of oppression that would make that difficult. And this can be unconscious. This can be as simple as having a family. This can be writing poetry. This can be pursuing beauty and truth in a world that makes those things harder to achieve. So it's just keep on living, even in a context that makes your life difficult because of your race or some other factor, right? But then there's another level of advocacy, and this is more intentional. This is taking up a cause and deliberately shining a light on it, supporting it maybe through donations, volunteerism, hashtag activism, right? Raising awareness. And that takes a level of commitment and intentionality, and there might be a cost for you speaking up, right? And then there's another level, which I'm calling activism. And this is what we traditionally think of. These are people who are marching in the streets, boycotting, maybe getting arrested. They're the full-time organizers and things of that nature. So when I talk about Elizabeth Keckley, who in today's terms would be sort of like a dressmaker to the stars. She made dresses for Mary Todd Lincoln and the elite class in Washington, D.C. She's a Black woman. And it's during the Civil War that she uses her successful business and her connections to create a fund for recently freed Black people to help them, right? That's one form of advocacy and activism. But there's also H. Ford Douglass, no relation to Frederick Douglass, who was so light-skinned, he could pass as white. And he did, but not in order to escape oppression and be considered white. He did it so that he could muster into the Union Army during the Civil War before they were enlisting Black soldiers. He had such solidarity with his people that he was going to pass as white so he could fight for Black emancipation. And that's a form of resistance as well. And one last story I'll tell, because everybody knows Harriet Tubman. We know her for the Underground Railroad. She went back and forth more than 10 times to free enslaved people. But she also helped the Union Army. She was a spy, she was an informant, and she helped lead the Combahee River Raid, which freed more people in one night than all of her trips on the Underground Railroad. And she has military honors to this day.
Coming up is a short break, followed by a discussion on the personal cost of political engagement, the historical figures Jemar most admires, and his new video series, The Roadmap to Ruin. Hey friends, Lee Seacamp of No Small Endeavor here. Hey, would you like to expand the community of people talking about the things you like to talk about? Here's an easy way to do that. And I would be most grateful if you were to do so. Go over to your favorite podcast listening app, click on Reviews, and leave No Small Endeavor a glowing 5-star review. Tell folks perhaps about some episode you liked in particular, and tell folks what you like generally about No Small Endeavor. The topics, the dashingly handsome, articulate host, or whatever it is that floats your boat. That will help more people find us which will expand the community of people talking about the things you like to talk about, especially when you make it one of those 5-star reviews. Thanks. I wonder what sort of emotional toll for you personally there is in doing the kind of work you do. As you're unearthing these stories and you're seeing the costs that people pay over and over again, what's that like for you internally yourself? How do you process that?
Studying this history is intellectually and emotionally taxing, to the extent that, as I mentioned, I wrote The Color of Compromise while I was in graduate school. I actually changed my dissertation topic because I didn't want to write another lengthy project about white Christian racism. So I changed it to focus more on Black Christian resistance to racism. So still in the same ballpark, but I chose to focus on the ways that people pushed back rather than the ways people compromised and were complicit. So that was one impact. On a relational level, I lost a lot of the community that I had learned the faith in. So after I became a teacher, I also was a principal of a middle school for several years. And then after that, I went to seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. I thought I was going to be a local church pastor. And so I became an intern at a local church, and I was on the track to be an ordained minister. And Black Lives Matter comes, I'm writing articles, I'm doing podcasts, and getting lots of pushback. And there was this one incident, even at my church, where I had said something about Trump, I believe, and I was slated to preach at the church, which I had done several times already. And they told me, we're not going to have you preach. Not that they necessarily disagreed with what I was saying, but that it might be a distraction to some members of the congregation. And that was a wake-up call for me, that a lot of times what is driving people's actions around justice is not the sentiment of how do we prevent harm, how do we make sure we do what's right, but it's fear. It's fear about what people will say. And that to me is so devastating, and it weighs so heavy on me, because you look at the figures in the spirit of justice and they risked everything to speak up and do what was right. And to me, we have to honor that legacy. And when we refuse to do so, it really betrays people, not only in the past, but in the present day. And so I so deeply want folks to simply have courage. The work of justice is daunting. You're going up against a status quo. You're going up against powers that be. You're going up against wealthy people. It requires courage. But it's that courage that I think humanizes us. It's that courage that brings us a measure of empathy. You can't speak up for a cause of justice without caring about other people. And I think it gives us a sober-mindedness. It's a clear-eyed view of reality and a defiant hope in the midst of it. A refusal to say that what's bad now will always be bad and I can't do anything about it. Because I believe hope is not so much a feeling, but action. And when we take steps that lead to human flourishing, we are in fact demonstrating hope. Courage, I think, is an act of hope.
Is there any one or more of those stories that you told that have kind of become friends to you in a metaphorical sense?
One of my absolute historical heroes is Fannie Lou Hamer. Thankfully, more and more people are learning about her, but she's less well known than her life deserves. She was born in 1917 in Sunflower County, Mississippi, so the Delta. She was born as the 20th of 20 children to a poor sharecropping family. And she grew up She became a sharecropper herself. She only achieved a 6th grade formal education. She married a sharecropper. She would have lived and died in obscurity, as so many Black sharecroppers did, except for one fateful day in 1962. She went to a presentation at her church, and it was about voting rights. And when they asked for volunteers to go attempt to register to vote, she said, "I raised my hand as high as it could go." And she went to the courthouse shortly later with a small group of people. They were turned away at gunpoint, but that only increased her resolve. This is a person who had every strike against her, humanly speaking. She was poor, she was Black, and she was a woman. And yet, in the face of all of these intersecting identities that made life harder for her, she demonstrated phenomenal courage. She said, "Ain't no such thing as you hate people and hope to see God's face." She famously said, "No one's free until everyone's free." And she's also famous for, in 1964, being part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was a biracial coalition that staged a protest against the all-white Mississippi delegation. So they go to the 1964 Democratic National Convention. She gives a testimony on the floor that's so powerful, Lyndon B. Johnson, president at the time, cuts off her speech and gives this bogus announcement about like the 9-month anniversary of something or other, which is totally made up, right? But she's speaking in her Southern dialect, and people understand the authenticity and the credibility that she's bringing. And because she's in the Delta, because her faith was such a huge part of her activism, and because of her courage, she's one of my historical heroes and one of my historical friends.
Recently, you've been doing some new work with a video series, a lot of work calling the church to resist anti-democratic forces currently at play. So tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. As a historian, there are some positive moments when you live through history, like when Murray Evers said, "There's something about the spirit of justice." Then there's the negative moments when you're living through history. And we are living through historic times. On a bare basis, we've never had a president impeached twice. We've never had a president convicted of felonies. We've never had a president in quite these circumstances. And what it's bringing is what I would call fascism. And I know a lot of people will disagree on that, particularly on partisan lines. But at the very least, we can acknowledge these are historic times. And one of the things that I do is I travel and I speak constantly across the country, mainly in churches. And I was dismayed and concerned that people perhaps didn't recognize the urgency of the moment. We are in a constitutional crisis where it's not clear if the checks and balances will hold, if the executive branch will heed the judicial branch, if the legislative branch can do its work effectively. And I wanted people, particularly Christians, to understand what MLK called the fierce urgency of now. And so I did this video series called Roadmap to Ruin: How the Church Can Resist the Dismantling of Democracy. Part 1 is about signs of ruin. Are we being alarmist? Are we Chicken Little saying the sky's falling when it's really not that bad? Well, I go through all of the reasons why I think we ought to be more alarmed, not less. Episode 2 is Architects of Ruin. The president gets all the attention, but he's not the only one. There is a cadre of folks in this administration that are quietly doing the work of dismantling the institutions that sort of hold our politics and government together. And then the third episode is about Roadmap to White Christian Nationalism. And so that episode's about what is white Christian nationalism? How does it show up as a political force with a veneer of religion? And then the last episode is Roadmap to Resistance. The most frequent question I get these days is, what can we do as we see democracy crumbling before our very eyes? And so that episode is dedicated to some practical steps that we can take. And it's meant for everyone. It's free on YouTube, but it's in particular for churches, because I don't want us one day, 30, 40 years from now, to look back and say the church was complicit. The church was passive. I want us to be able to say we stood up for justice when democracy was on the line.
You speak of the ARC, A-R-C, of racial justice, awareness, relationships, commitment. So unpack that for us kind of as a way as we start to close.
What I talk about in my second book, How to Fight Racism, is the ARC of racial justice, which, as you said, is an acronym for awareness, relationships, commitment. Rather than just giving you 50 different, hey, try this, I want to give you these categories, this framework to think about your activism in a holistic way. So awareness is all the things we do to build our knowledge and information about race, about justice. And it's listening to this podcast, it's watching a documentary, it's going to a museum. We've got to be informed, but we can't stop there. We can't just have big heads. Justice is also relational. In a Christian frame, I often say that when God wanted to reconcile humanity to God and each other, God didn't send a tweet or a TikTok video. God sent a person, Jesus Christ, to build relationship. And relationships are at the heart of justice because ultimately it's about people. And it's about loving people well, loving your neighbor well, right? But we can't stop there. We can't just have soft hearts for it. We also have to do the commitment part, which I mean more than staying the course. By commitment, I mean we have to commit ourselves to systemic, institutional, policy change, the levers that affect more than one person at a time. It goes to the ways we've set up society in ways that advantage certain people and disadvantage others. And within those, awareness, relationship, commitment, we can list different actions. So it's a framework to help our brains hold on to the multifaceted work of doing justice in the world.
Been talking to Dr. Jemar Tisby, professor of history at Simmons College in Kentucky, the author most recently of The Spirit of Justice. Jemar, thanks so much, both for your generosity with your time today, but much more for your work in the world. We're grateful for you and grateful for the time with you today.
Lee, I appreciate your thoughtful and generative questions. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with New York Times bestselling author Dr. Jemar Tisby, discussing his most recent book, The Spirit of Justice. If you missed a portion of this interview or would like to have access to the complete unabridged version, you can follow our podcast wherever you listen. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.